So thank you, Ian, for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you sort of run a popular website and blog called In This Together, where you write about your sort of series of thoughts that sort of range from, what people would call conspiracy theory, about the sort of new world order, and, things like globalism, the issue of climate change, you know, and even the sort of monetary system, and very, very lately, the sort of COVID-19, which you have gone on to call a scamdemic instead of
Yeah,
a sort of pandemic. So,
yeah.
so that's something that has sort of piqued my interest quite a bit. So I'd like to get started on probably, the sort of new world order, and you sort of write about that, and you sort of write about the lack of democracy. So, and the overbearing idea of a singular government, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
even in like sort of today's world, that seems sort of highly improbable. I mean, you have like various countries, each with sort of differing opinions. You have China, that's a sort of rising superpower, that's a sort of complete communist police state, and then you have on the other end you have the sort of Western powers, which are more quote unquote free and like democratic. So, how do you see something like this eventually becoming a reality in our world?
Well, I don't think we're talking about a government
Right,
as we might consider a government that we elect.
right,
It's more about it's a long-standing plan for global governance. So, I mean, if you think about, I mean, we've already got systems in place which are like that. So if we look in terms of health, obviously we've got the World Health Organization who formulate policy, and that policy then cascades down through various national governments. But it's governance at a world level. So if you were looking at more kind of like if you're looking at it from a geopolitical perspective, so something like the United Nations, before that the League of Nations. I mean, these plans have been. I mean, one of the things that is quite interesting about the concept of so-called conspiracy theory would be that conspiracies it infers that it's some kind of secret that that you can't possibly know about it because it's hidden, it's secret, that kind of idea. Whereas in fact, these kind of plans for global governance there have been whole books written about it,
right,
about and leading politicians around the world have frequently discussed it, openly planned for it. So it always amuses me somewhat that people kind of associate conspiracy theory with some kind of secret hidden agenda when
right,
there's nothing secret about it. It's all out in the open, and it's based on evidence that anyone can read. It's all in the public domain. So,
right,
for example, if we go and look at Agenda 2030, for example, which is a United Nations document that is freely available, anyone can read, and it quite clearly lays out a system of global governance, which is, so the question is, I suppose the question would be, and a lot of people would say, well, what's wrong with that? And I mean, and I would say, as someone that is probably, well, have certainly been labelled as a conspiracy theorist, that's a good question.
right,
It isn't. It doesn't mean that it necessarily is a bad idea. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not a bad idea. But the problem is, where does democratic accountability come into that? How do we as citizens affect the decision making process? It's hard enough for people, especially we've seen recently with the coronavirus problem, that to affect democratic decision making in our own countries, let alone let alone if that decision making is made at a global level. And this is why people like the World Economic Forum and so forth, their vision for global governance is what they call basing on stakeholder capitalism. So the question is, who are the stakeholders? Is it the people, or is it multinational corporations, international banks? That's who they mean by the stakeholders. They don't mean us. you
right,
know.
right. So just to like sort of follow up on that, like you like, and especially with this current situation of COVID-19, we have seen this development of this like biosecurity state, right, where
Yes.
there have been so many like rules and regulations put on the sort of common people. Here in Toronto, we have seen, for like example, that all small stores were sort of mandated to be shut, but at the same time, your like big chains, your like Walmarts and others, sort of remained open, right? What is the sort of logic of like having big stores, big like corporations remain open, while your small mom and pop stores, your small boutique stores had to remain closed, not just for a sort of few days, but weeks and like months on end. So we had like these kind of rules put in place, and in addition to that, one of the sort of big changes that I've noticed was cash was ostracized, right? Like we noticed primarily like sort of move to like digital payments now. Digital payments would essentially put the power back in the sort of government's hands, right? If I don't have any cash and I'm not dealing with sort of cash with a store, and if the sort of government wants to like shut me down, all they have to do is like call up the sort of banks and tell them shut them down, and I will go hungry for the sort of foreseeable future, right? So,
Yeah.
how do you see sort of COVID-19 expediting this, biosecurity state and the globalist agenda here?
Well, I mean, I think, when people, you referred earlier to a post that I'd written referring to it as a scamdemic,
Right.
and I think one of the problems is that when you talk about it in those terms, people think that you're claiming that COVID-19 doesn't exist, that it's a
Yes.
hoax,
Yes.
and all this kind of thing. That's not what the agenda has been exploited. I would say COVID-19. I think that there is clearly a disease which, sadly, many people have died from, but the opportunity has been seized as I can't remember which one of the was it Rahm Emanuel who said never let a good crisis go to waste.
Correct.
And that appears to be what's happened in this case. So clearly there were plans already in place for the creation of for global governance systems, including the creation of a new monetary system. So what we've seen certainly from the Bank of International Settlements and the IMF are again all in the public domain, open discuss, and from the Bank of England and from Canada Central Bank, open discussions about central bank digital currency, potentially as a new world currency. So, what better opportunity to push forward that agenda than off the back of something as destabilizing and something which is already, as you pointed out, the economic devastation that has been wrought by coronavirus is we're only just starting to see it unfurl at the moment. I mean, in the UK, we've got a tax-paying working population. So if you think people that are in employment that are paying tax, of the estimates vary, but probably around 30 million to 32, 33 million people across the UK who are effectively the taxpayers, the tax earners, if you like.
Right.
Well, we're already looking at potentially 9 million people who are. We've got. I think about I can't remember what it is exactly. We've got about 2.5 million people already unemployed. There are about another 4.3 million people on furlough. Then there are all the people with small businesses like the cafes and even small businesses like the service industries, and people that supply, the suppliers for bigger industries, whose businesses have collapsed and are being propped up by the government. Now, the assumption is that when furlough ends and when some of the schemes end that are supporting businesses, I think they're talking about October 2021, that somehow this occurred, because we keep hearing from our Prime Minister and from yours, Build Back Better, in fact from everyone in the world, Build Back Better, that these businesses are just going to bounce back. Well, there's a lot of reason to think that isn't going to happen. So we could be looking at the kind of depression which, similar to the kind of depression that we saw in the 1930s. And what you always see with a large economic upheaval like that is, and it's, again, a question that we should not be afraid to ask, cui bono, who benefits? Well, who always benefits from these kind of upheavals?
Right.
It is always the bankers and the global corporations, in looking at the small businesses, as you were talking about the destruction of the small businesses. Well, what does that create? It creates in the country, whether it's Canada or whether it's the UK, a tremendous amount of assets that are worthless.
Right.
So who's going to have the capital to buy up those assets when all this is over? Same people, multinational corporations, the international banks. Right. And this is a, if it had not happened before, if you could look back through history and say, well, something that is not happening, we've got no reason to suspect that it might happen. But it has happened before, many, many times. So we've got no reason to suspect that it won't happen.
Right. Yeah. Can we just sort of recount any of these past incidences where sort of these sort of global catastrophes were exploited by governments, by big banks and big corporations at the expense of its populace? Has there been anything similar, like the sort of COVID-19 situation? I know in sort of 1918 we had the Spanish flu, but I was not able to find any documentation which alluded to the fact that these the big banks or the sort of big corporations were able to sort of seize the moment and then exploit that crisis for their own benefit.
Well, I mean, if you don't have to look very far. I mean, if you look at the Second World War,
right?
The Second World War was funded by both sides of the Atlantic at the same time. So, if you look at, for example, how the German restructuring worked, how did the German have this economic miracle where they went from people taking wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread to building the most extensive motorway network system anyone had ever seen at the time in 1930s, all part of Hitler's great economic miracle. Well, that was funded by Wall Street. The Americans and the British banking cartels were paying for that, loaning the money. Then we have the massive, obviously the conflict, and again you see that American the Rockefellers were certainly paying for the fuel additives that enabled the German Luftwaffe to bomb London. So they're constantly international business in this way, and into the exchange of money flows across the world has always been playing both sides of the coin at the same time, Right. And after the Second World War, then you get the continuing restructuring of the Soviet Union. You have the continuation of Stalin's 5-year plans. Again, you think, we live in this world where we believe that those are the bad guys, these are the good, they're the baddies, we're the goodies.
Right.
It is just so much more complex than that. So Stalin's 5-year plans, I mean, one of the big sort of showpieces of Stalin's plans was the car plant at Grozny. Well, that was built by Ford. So we mustn't. I think part of the way that the system works at the moment is that we see the world in terms of black and white. We see the world as in that there is certainly good and evil in the world. I'm not denying that, and there are good people and there are bad people. I'm not saying that for one moment. What I'm saying is, when you're looking at geopolitics on a global scale, it is far more complex than just, the baddies invaded the goodies.
Right.
It just doesn't work like that.
Right. I mean, now for example, you sort of mentioned that Ford had sort of built this factory in Soviet Russia, but I mean those are independent corporations, right? They don't necessarily reflect the sort of ideology of the state at that time. So how do you then differentiate between what is the official state position versus individual corporations? I mean, surely independent corporations and companies should have the freedom to sort of go and do business wherever they please. No.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I'm not saying that. I think that the difficulty comes that you can't differentiate between international corporations and the state.
Right.
I mean that we believe that we elect politicians and that a politician makes decisions. That's the fundamental basis of our democracy. Right. Or so we think. I would argue that it isn't democracy, but represent what we call democracy, which is representative democracy. So we elect someone and we expect them to we invest in them the authority to make decisions. That's the idea.
Right.
But of course, politicians, even the most senior politicians, are not making decisions independently. There's a lobby industry around them. There's all the factors that they have to consider about their own political support and their opponents and all that kind of stuff, which is reasonable. But the point being is that multinational corporations, and if we're looking at the world level, so if we take the recent the coronavirus situation, the pandemic, you've got huge financial interests that stand to make tremendous amount of money from the outcome of what happens in this pandemic. Well, those are the same financial interests that are deeply involved with the decision making around the pandemic, such as the World Health Organization.
Right.
The World Health Organization, the decisions that it makes, the policies that it advocates for, and the determinations it makes about policy on a global level have a direct impact on the institutions which are funding it. So of course those institutions, and I'm talking about pharmaceutical companies, people like Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, CEPI, are all working in partnership with government. It's an interlinked global network of partnership relationships.
Right.
So we can't expect that we can just vote for one political party or one leader and seriously believe that they are going to make a difference, because they're not. They're just part of an international network, and they are a cog in the machine as much as anybody else.
Right.
Now they may have more authority within the machine than you and I, but then nonetheless they are just part of it.
Right. Makes sense. But then how do you see, what alternate form of government is out there? I mean, we have seen throughout the sort of past, we have monarchs, which don't really sort of work that well. We have seen that in the sort of Middle East and so on. We have, communism, which has also been mostly a failed set of failed system of government. And representative democracy is also not really democracy in the sense that we have elected officials now having to cater to not just what we want them to do, but also these lobbying firms, corporations that sort of provide them donations. So in your opinion, what is the ideal form of government then to sort of navigate all this?
Well, I believe that the ideal form of government is no government.
Right.
Just
anarchy.
Well, anarchy, yeah, but I mean, I would say voluntarism.
Right.
So a voluntary society where we exchange goods for. I mean, the thing is, we already run our society pretty much on a voluntary basis.
Right.
I mean, I'm not compelling you to speak to me today.
Of course. Yeah.
You know, you didn't have to force me to talk to you.
Right.
You know, the good example would perhaps be how food gets from the farm to our dinner plates. I mean, that is a massive global effort, and no one's coercing anybody to do anything. People are all acting independently in their own best interests. People are trying to make a living. People are doing what they need to do to make a living. No one's forcing anyone to do anything. And the only time that force comes into the equation is when government gets involved. Then you have regulations and, you know, and laws. And now, so I wouldn't say that law is a bad thing either. It's perfectly possible to have a voluntary society which has got law. And I would personally, if I was going to live in a voluntary society where I had an opportunity to do that, I wouldn't want to live in one that didn't have laws, you know, because that would be chaos, which is what most people think anarchy is. But anarchy is not chaos. But the problem is with government is the fact is we believe, and we're brought up with this from almost, you know, from the moment we can hear. That to believe that authority works. So we just automatically assume that, yes, someone must be in charge. And that's the way that it must work. Because if someone wasn't in charge, we'd never build a road.
Right.
You know, how can we not do something if someone hasn't got power, if they haven't got authority? Well, the problem with that is that if you look at every single disaster that has happened to humanity, throughout its history, it started because someone was in charge. You know, it started. Well, I mean, I mean, if we look at the current global situation, I don't know about you, but I've got absolutely no desire at all to hurt anybody else, invade Syria, invade Russia, have you know, steal food from China,
right,
or, you know, have a trade war with China. I don't want to do any of that, and I don't know any other person that would want to do that. Only governments want to do that.
right.
So I think at some point, you know, I mean, and I know, I mean, what I've just said is obviously explaining it in very simplistic terms, but I think at some point we do need to start looking at government itself and thinking, well, is this the only way? Because there are other systems, stateless systems, voluntary systems that could work just as well.
Right.
And that wouldn't mean either getting rid of the rule of law or democracy. Because if it's voluntary, then people can voluntarily have even a representative democratic system if they want, because that would be the nature of a voluntary society.
Right.
But what no one could do is force or coerce somebody else to do something. So that would be about the only rule, that you can't do that. Well, if you can't do that, then you can't have monopolies. You can't have, you know, sort of the worst forms of oppression. All those things wouldn't happen if we didn't implicitly accept that someone has the right to exert authority over us.
Correct.
So it's about. I think we really, because certainly what's happening at the moment with COVID-19, what we are walking into is a totalitarian state. And that is happening in the UK, it's happening in Canada, the US, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, everywhere.
Right. I mean, I have constantly had this, you know, I've just been like thinking about this myself actually. Why don't we have more transparency in like government, right? Why don't we know? Why can't we like log into an app or some kind of website and see, for like example, what is this sort of government's budget for this year? What are they planning on doing with this budget, right? And why like if they are like if one government wants to build a sort of pipeline through a sort of particular province, who has been given the sort of tender for that project, right? What's the sort of price of that? What's the economic benefit that's like going to be reaped? What are their like projections? I mean, if you like sort of think of it, we are the shareholders, because we pay our taxes and we cast in our votes. So why don't we have that transparency? Why is it always that we elect somebody and then we hope that they're going to do the sort of best, right? And in addition to that, a sort of more transparent form of government will allow us to then vote on projects, on like policies, not just on like a particular person or a political party, right? Like for example, if in the US we have the Republicans, that is, let's say, and I'm just like making this up, but like let's say they're pro gun and anti abortion, for like example, and the Democrats are anti gun, pro abortion. But what if my values stand at pro gun, pro abortion? Whom do I vote for? How do I do it, right? So I should have the ability to vote on policies, to sort of vote on law, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily into a party, which means I have to then compartmentalize my thoughts and then say, okay, you know what, I am willing to forego X, Y, Z to sort of gain A, B, C.
Yeah.
Right? So I just find that whole thing also quite contradictory, and I would totally agree with you in saying that this really isn't a democracy, right? This is just a sort of perception. It's an illusion of democracy. We don't really have the sort of right to vote on, law, to sort of vote on policies, to vote on government projects.
Yeah, I mean there are other forms of democracy. I mean, there's direct democracy, the kind of model that they operate in Switzerland.
Right.
So in Switzerland, the Swiss do get that opportunity. They do have the opportunity. I mean, they've just voted to stop the Swiss government from rolling out digital identities. So they do vote on an issue by issue basis. Okay. But of course, Switzerland's not a very large populous country.
Right.
With a the bigger the country gets. I mean, when you're talking about how many people in the US, and about 300 million people, that's a lot of different opinions. So I mean, I can sort of see that from one perspective, you could argue that would be unworkable, because how could you vote on every single aspect of policy, and would people be that interested in doing so? I mean, one of the things that you just said there is, why don't we have more transparency? Well, we do. The Bank of England put out their reports every year, every quarter. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, the government put most information on their website. So, for example, in March the 19th, I think it was, 2020, the Public Health England put on their website that they downgraded COVID-19 from a high consequence infectious disease. They downgraded it due to low mortality. I mean, that's not, but and that's public information. You just have to go and look for it. But how many people are sufficiently interested to do that? Now, the net effect of that is, months down the line, when people like myself say it's not a high mortality disease, it's a low mortality disease, people think, well, you're just a conspiracy theorist. But this is information that's in the public domain. It's on the government's website. Anyone can go and read it. Right. It's the same with the statistics. The Office of National Statistics have been in the UK have been putting out mortality statistics for England and Wales all year, which you can download, and it's only a spreadsheet. I mean, you can download it, and if you can they're a bit complex sometimes. You're just trying to figure out how they work.
Right.
But nonetheless, it is all information in the public domain. So no one in the UK has any reason to believe that COVID-19 is some really deadly disease that's killing people left, right and centre. Because it's not in the data. It's not in the statistics. The government themselves say it is a low mortality disease. Public Health England have already said that. So So, but this is where the problem comes in, and I, going back to what you're saying about more involvement in democratic processes. So, my suggestion for a voluntary society, what that means is full responsibility for every single action is shared equally by everybody. So we can't blame a government for a disaster. It's our fault.
Right.
Because we have to take responsibility for it. So
but then
when people
sorry.
So when we're talking about direct democracy, that's kind of a step away from towards more individual responsibility. But if we really want to tackle the issues that we've got at the moment with what I would suggest is runaway government that is doing things which nobody voted for and nobody wants, if to tackle that issue, we have to realise that the problem is us.
Right.
Because we've allowed this to happen. So we have to change it.
True, but then what would like the taking of responsibility mean? Would it mean that we then collectively as a society decide to then pay more taxes to sort of cover up for this disaster, or we then sort of volunteer, I don't know, 2 hours off our day every day to go and help out with X NGO? Like what does taking more responsibility here in this context mean? Because I mean, responsibility could differ, and then how do you enforce somebody to be more responsible or less responsible, right? So
well, I mean, currently we've got the situation at the moment where we pay tax. That tax goes to a third party, and they decide what they're going to spend it on.
Right.
Right. So I might think that I don't want to pay tax to I mean, I can't imagine that I would, but let's say, for example, that I don't want to pay tax to fund the NHS.
Right.
But I don't mind paying tax to, clean the streets. Well, what would be the difference if we didn't pay any tax? Nobody paid any tax. But if we are in a community, if you and I lived in the same community and we want the streets cleaning, we would have to pay for it. So how would we do that? We would employ a contractor to come and do it. Well, currently what we're doing is giving the money to somebody else so that they can employ a contractor to come and do it.
Right. So essentially what you're trying to say is like it's complete free market.
Free, yeah. I mean, I would say voluntarism based on a free market economy. Yeah,
free market. But I mean, just very like recently, and I'm just trying to play like devil's advocate here. But just like very recently, we saw the snowstorm in Austin, where the entire energy grid was blown out, which essentially runs on which essentially is private enterprise, right? And we saw like people suffering, people not having energy, or like not having electricity for like days, and we saw some people whose energy fees were hiked like through the roof because now they're owned by private corporations and not governments, which is
what was it $900 to charge a Tesla, wasn't it, or something like that?
And I actually saw this bill of this person who had like 17K bill, like his electricity bill was like 17K, and he was showing it on the sort of video. So I mean, where does sort of socialist ideas, like what's the sort of perfect mix between capitalism and like socialism, right? I mean, here in like Canada, we sort of have a socialist healthcare, right? It's like universal healthcare, where everyone, whether you like it or not, you pay taxes that goes into providing you healthcare. And say what you want about it. I mean, sometimes you have to wait a little longer at the sort of emergency line. It's not as efficient as private, but it does the job, right? Like if like you get your medical services on time, you're fully paid, you don't have to really worry about emergency when it God like forbid it, like when you break a leg or something, government takes care of you from A to Z, and then you also get benefits from the government on behalf of your employer, right? I mean, these are all benefits that you sort of pay for.
Yeah.
But so again, like I'm just trying to think, and this is a very open discussion about how this sort of balance between free market enterprise and socialist ideals, right? Like, where's that perfect balance? Of course, yeah.
Sorry. No,
And-
carry on.
I mean, nothing should be 100% social. That also doesn't work for sure. But at the same time, 100% capitalist also may or may not work, right? At the end of the day, and I mean, at the end of the day, free market or like companies, they're purely worried about bottom line. You could make the same argument for the government as well, but they do have that iota of social welfare inbuilt, right? It's not the same thing, really.
Yeah, theoretically.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing I wouldn't do. I don't see that it necessarily has to be a balance between. I mean, we tend to think of things in terms of left wing, right wing, socialist, capitalist. These are the terms that we use to explain ideas to ourselves, right?
Right.
But we have, where that has brought us to currently is on the precipice of totalitarianism.
Right.
We are looking at the wholesale removal of our rights based upon the idea that there's a bad disease abroad. Now, there certainly is a bad disease. I mean, and people have died from it, that's true. But even if it was the plague, even if people were dying in their millions, which I know globally they say people are dying in their millions, but let's say it really was bad and people were dropping dead in the streets, that still would not justify the removal of all our freedoms and rights. Right. Nothing justifies that. There's no excuse for going, well, it's a really bad situation, people are dying, therefore we must take away all your freedoms and rights. I mean, it's a non sequitur. It doesn't make any sense. Right. But talking about the situation in Texas, so that's a classic example of how, if anything can make anything worse, it's government.
Okay.
So by through a system of corruption and subsidies, they created an energy market, a wholly inefficient and dangerously rubbish energy market. Why? Well, for the enrichment of private corporations. That's why. That's why they did it, and they did it because they were lobbied to do it. So they were lobbied to create the situation which caused disaster. So when something, and I mean, apart from that, that goes back to the global idea of sustainability and the Green New Deal and so forth, where, we're not ready. We're not in a position yet to have a renewable energy-based grid. It doesn't work because it keeps snowing and it's cloudy and it rains and there are spikes in energy in the winter. So we're not in that position to be able to do that. So what they do, they create this perfect storm of the worst possible conditions for a catastrophic failure of not only the energy grid but the energy market, which happens at the worst possible time, which of course is likely when you have horrendous snowstorms. And we think that the idea of that somehow is better regulation or better government, but it's government and regulation that caused it.
Right.
So let's say that you were in a voluntary society, right? Do you want to have the lights working in your house?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to have a decent healthcare system?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
Do you want to have a road that leads to your place of work?
So essentially, what you're saying is then.
So why wouldn't you pay for it?
Right.
You're paying for it now.
Right.
So why wouldn't you pay for it in the future? Why do you need another party, a third party, to come in and say, you give me all your money and I promise that I will do all the things that you need to do. I will give you road systems. I will give you an energy infrastructure. I'll give you all these things. All you need to do is pay me and I'll sort it out for you.
Right.
Right? Whereas if I would say, well, no, that's all right. if I don't have to pay you, does that mean I've got more money in my pocket? Yes, it does.
Of course.
So if I've got more money in my pocket, why would I not choose to have a decent hospital? So why would I allow a system to come into being where the energy market was so hopelessly imbalanced that it was obvious to anyone that if there was a disaster like a horrendous snowstorm, the whole thing was going to go bang. You wouldn't allow that to happen if people were working in their best interests and working collectively for the good. Because it is in my interest that my neighbour is in a good position. It's not in my interest that my neighbour is, sharpening his axe.
Right.
That's not in my interest.
Of course, yeah.
So the idea that people cannot work collaboratively for a better world, it is drilled into us, that idea. We are told that we can't do it, that we're incapable of doing it, and we must have some sort of government leader telling us what to do, because if the government doesn't tell us what to do, it will be a disaster. Well, I hate to point it out to everybody, but all the disasters that have happened in the last 2,000 years have been under government.
Right.
So
Well, you cannot argue with that, but just this idea of the government, has it been tried anywhere? And I'm not just talking about like contemporary history, but has it been tried maybe in the sort of olden days, in the early sort of days of civilization? Have we seen like empirical evidence of this type of civilization and of this type of government successful? What would an implementation of something like this sort of look like?
The idea of the agora is the marketplace, literally. Right. The marketplace. So that goes back to sort of, which is funny actually, because it is both the agora goes back to the ancient sort of Greek tradition, as does democracy.
Right.
These two things were intrinsically entwined. Democracy was the rule of law, or the rule of law by a jury. So democracy meant, I couldn't. Every decision ultimately of what now we might call lawful decision came down to the decision of a jury. So that was people power, demos kratos, people power, power by the people. And that's where it comes from. Demos kratos is the notion of law by rule of jury. The rule of law is the law of the land. It is the rule of the law by a jury decision.
Right.
Which was part of the principle of the open marketplace of the agora. So the agora was where the people would come and gather, literally to exchange goods and meet and chat and discuss things. And from that comes the idea of collective responsibility for decision making.
Correct. Okay.
So if you look forward in other periods throughout history, there have been attempts at kind of, I can't remember the name of the place, but there's a place. I can't remember the name of the place. There's a place at the moment that has been an anarchic state or an anarchist state for something like 30 or 40 years, but I can't remember where it is now. But basically, no, because governments control decision making, because it's in government's interest to control decision making. There have been many attempts to set up anarchic states or stateless states, but they haven't lasted very long because governments take them over.
Right.
So, but the idea of working voluntarily is everywhere. It is the basis of our society. It's not like it doesn't exist. People always say, well, if voluntarist principles worked, we would see countries that work on voluntarist principles. Well, you do see one. You're living in one. All countries work on voluntarist principles. Well, successful ones anyway. So, but government is like another layer that we add on top So it's kind of like the voluntarist principle is the part of our society that would be the good stuff. You know, thriving economic exchange, free trade, you know, people being able to meet freely and discuss ideas and come up with new ideas, scientific innovation, technological innovation. No one's forcing anyone to do any of that stuff. That is all voluntary. The only force part comes in when they come and take money off you.
Right.
That's where the force comes into it.
Right.
So really, you know, the idea that, and the people often make the argument that there are no successful anarchist states, which is true in terms of from a historical perspective, but that's because anarchist thinking and anarchist ideology is really literally means kind of freedom, free trade. Not always, because you get the anarcho-syndicalists and the anarcho-communists and all those people that would say, no, that's not true. But the point is, it's about being able to freely exchange ideas and freely act in our own best interests, which is the human condition. So we can live that way on the proviso that we have to understand that therefore we take responsibility for everything. So we can't say, it's not my problem. So if you've got a problem in your community, for example, talking about what would happen to the welfare state. So if you've got a destitute family in your community, it's not up, in a stateless society, it would not be up to the government to sort that situation out. So you as a community member would either have to sit there and think, well, I'm happy to see them starve, or people would come together and support them. Now, personally, I don't think that people would sit around and watch people starve. I don't think they would do that. I think people would come together and support people that are in need.
Right.
I think that is a natural human response. I may be wrong about that,
Right.
but that's my sense of it. I mean, most people that I know, most people that I meet are good people. They would not turn their back on someone that was in dire need. If I saw an old lady struggling and she fell over in the snow or something like that, there is no way that I would leave her lying there. I would help her up, and I'm not saying that, oh, check me out.
Right.
I mean, what I mean is that's human nature. You would do the same, wouldn't you?
Of course.
We're not. But it's been drummed into us that somehow there's something wrong with us, that we can't act out of our understanding of our own sense of humanity, and we can, and we do all the time.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense, and I've never actually heard a sort of explanation of the anarchist state so eloquently. So that was a very good explanation. I think that's pretty much all that I had to discuss. I mean, we had a sort of couple of extra points, but I think we are already running out of time. And what you said, I think, makes it is a sort of complete episode in itself. So thank you so much for your time, Iain. This has been wonderful.
That's my pleasure, mate.
Yeah,
my pleasure.
It was wonderful chatting with you, and hopefully we see sort of society and sort of communities moving in a way that's more transparent, that's more surrounding the sort of well-being of the entire community. And
I think it's so. We've just got to come together, mate. We've all got to come together, because it is us and them.
Yes.
You know. So we have got to. We've got to forget about all these things like political dogmas and belief systems, and we have just got to support each other and get through this, because it's not going to be good.
Yeah, it's not. Well, thank you, Iain. Thank you, and have a
right,
wonderful rest of your evening.
Yeah, and you, mate. Again, good luck with your channel.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye.